August 1945. The jungle steamed like a fever dream near the outskirts of the Philippines. Cicadas screamed from the trees as Japanese women, nurses, clerks, translators, sat frozen under the humid sky. They had trained for death, not capture. Yet now, the war that was supposed to end with honor had dissolved into confusion, white flags, and the sound of boots in the mud. An American patrol entered the clearing, helmets glinting, rifles raised. "Hands up," someone shouted. The women obeyed, trembling, clutching the hems of their uniforms. Their emperor had surrendered days ago, but out here, they didn't know. In their minds, Japan still fought. The word, prisoner, didn't yet exist for them. It felt like an insult stitched into the air. Reports later estimated over 4,000 Japanese women were captured across the Pacific after VJ Day. Most were noncombatants, medical assistants, clerks, even teachers swept up in military zones. None expected mercy. They'd been told Americans were monsters who would kill or defile them. Instead, they were ordered to sit silent, waiting. A young woman named Haruko kept staring at her boots, refusing to meet the soldiers' eyes. "We were trained to die," she whispered to the nurse beside her, "not to be seen by enemy eyes." Her words would echo decades later in a testimony recorded for Japan's post-war archives. The sun kept rising higher, turning their khaki sleeves dark with sweat. Around noon, a sergeant unfolded a clipboard. An interpreter barked through the heat. "Prepare for delousing. Remove your clothing." For a moment, nobody moved. Then confusion turned to dread. The women froze, realizing what was being asked. Their hands tightened around their belts, their faces hollowing. What began as surrender was mutating into humiliation. The Americans claimed it was standard hygiene protocol, lice control, nothing personal. But in that jungle clearing, surrounded by strangers and rifles, the order felt like an assault on identity itself. As fabric rustled and boots shuffled in the dirt, something broke inside that group of captives. It wasn't just fear. It was the knowledge that survival might come at the cost of dignity. And when crates of new clothing were brought forward, stamped REJSTP Pazom Isui, the story turned darker. Before we go further, what city are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below. Because what happens next will leave you speechless. The jungle air thickened like soup. Heat shimmered off the tin roofs as the American interpreter shouted again. This time louder. "Remove your uniforms!" Now, the line of Japanese women didn't move. They stared straight ahead, faces drained, their shadows trembling on the dirt. Then a guard slammed his rifle butt into the ground. The sound cracked through the clearing. One nurse gasped. Another began to unbutton her collar, fingers shaking. Haruko, the one who had whispered about dying with honor, felt her pulse in her throat. The order was supposed to be about lice, they said, delousing. But everyone knew humiliation when they felt it. A Red Cross memo later noted that temperatures reached 38 degrees C that day. Over 200 prisoners were processed under that blazing sun, each forced to strip down, clothes piled like casualties of fabric at their feet. Their old uniforms, symbols of service and discipline, were carted away in sacks marked contaminated. One American soldier turned his face away, ashamed to watch. Another laughed. "You're clean now," someone muttered. The words felt like poison. From behind the interpreter's clipboard came a different sound, the rustle of canvas crates being opened. Inside, rough, striped uniforms, blue and white cotton, thin as gauze, stitched unevenly. Prison clothes. The women hesitated, realizing these weren't temporary delousing garments. These were their new identities. Prisoners. Strangers. Stripped not only of rank, but of self. We were told it was for hygiene. Haruko would later recall, but it was for power. She slipped one arm through the coarse sleeve, wincing as the fabric scratched her skin. Around her, others did the same, the stripes flickering in the sunlight like moving bars. From the guard tower, The Americans looked down at the line of striped figures. No longer soldiers, not yet civilians, just ghosts in borrowed cloth. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was erasure. One officer scribbled in his notebook, "Procedure complete. All compliant." Compliant, that was the word they used, as if obedience could wash away identity. By sundown, the jungle had turned gold, and the women sat in rows, barely recognizable. Their old khaki folded away, their new uniforms clinging like punishment. But those stripes, those circus-colored scars, were only the beginning. Because soon, they'd learn that the fabric itself had meaning. And that's where the next horror begins. Night fell like a curtain, but the camp didn't sleep. The new uniforms itched, stank, and clung with the weight of shame. Blue and white stripes, uneven, faded, almost mocking. Under the weak lantern light, the women stared at each other, realizing they all looked the same now, faceless. In one corner, a few women who'd been tailors before the war were ordered to repair torn sleeves. Their trembling hands worked through piles of fabric that smelled of sweat and mildew. Every stitch felt like surrender. Each thread whispered, "You're not who you were anymore." The material came from old prison stock. Records show cotton reused up to 15 times, often infested with lice and mold. The Americans called it standard issue. But to the captives, it was symbolic violence, a uniform built to erase. Haruko ran her fingers over the stripes, tracing each line as if reading her own sentence. "We look like circus clowns," one woman muttered bitterly. "Not soldiers." The laughter that followed wasn't joy. It was exhaustion turned hysterical. The Americans didn't mean the pattern to be cruel. It was just surplus fabric. But that's the thing about symbols. They don't ask permission to hurt. Every blue stripe felt like a wall closing in. Every white stripe like the empty space between memory and reality. As morning broke, guards lined them up again for roll call. The camp dogs barked as the women shuffled forward, the striped fabric rustling like dry leaves. A photographer passed through, snapping images for records. In the frames, no one smiled. From the outside, it looked orderly, clean, efficient, humane. But inside those uniforms, the women's identities had been stripped layer by layer. "We were ghosts," Haruko said later, pretending to be alive. When one woman refused to wear hers, she was left sitting half-naked until nightfall, mosquitoes biting, skin blistered. By morning, even she gave in. Resistance faded beneath the heat, the hunger, the hopelessness. But one man, an American medic assigned to the camp, noticed. He saw the bruises, the fear, the silent shame stitched into those stripes. And something in his conscience began to stir. Because even inside a war built on obedience, doubt can grow. And that doubt would soon start breaking the rules. The morning fog lifted slow, revealing a camp that looked strangely quiet, almost disciplined. From a distance, the striped uniforms gave an illusion of order. But up close they told another story. The fabric rubbed raw against skin. The smell of unwashed cotton hung heavy in the air. Guards called it standard POW issue. The prisoners knew better. The stripes weren't random. They were design. They erased individuality. They turned faces into patterns. Even the smallest act of rebellion, rolling up a sleeve, tying hair differently, was punished. Every woman became another body in a striped sea. Reports show that U.S. Command Circular 27B allowed reused uniforms for sanitation and control, but the rule was never meant for humiliation. Implementation twisted it. The women marched past male POWs who stared, laughed, or looked away. Some Americans joked, calling them striped dolls. That phrase spread through the camp like poison. One guard whispered, "Don't look too long, they're the enemy." But the word enemy began to sound hollow. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were broken shadows, shivering in fabric meant for men twice their size. Haruko clutched her collar tighter every time a camera appeared. Every stripe felt like a finger pointing. She said later, Enemy, enemy, enemy. The lines on her uniform were supposed to prevent escape, easy to spot from afar, but they also marked something deeper. Psychological containment, no rank, no identity, no privacy. One American medic, Sergeant Howard, watched them from across the yard. He'd seen war wounds, amputations, blood, but this felt worse. Not the visible kind of damage, but the kind that crept into the soul. During inspection, he noticed one woman's arm bleeding from where the rough seam had cut her. He offered a bandage. A guard shouted, "No fraternization." Howard froze. He hesitated, then gently placed the bandage on the ground and walked away. The woman picked it up when no one was watching. That night, Haruko whispered to her friend. One man looked ashamed. For us. The sentence hung in the air, trembling with both disbelief and gratitude. The act was small, invisible to command, but it cracked something open. Because in a system designed to erase empathy, even a moment of human hesitation can become rebellion. And that rebellion was about to take form in one man's quiet doubt. The rain came without warning, thick, warm, relentless. Mud swallowed the camp's walkways, and the striped uniforms clung like wet paper. Sergeant Howard stood under a tin awning, cigarette half-burned, eyes fixed on the women huddled near the fence. He wasn't supposed to look, he wasn't supposed to feel, but he couldn't unsee it anymore. A young woman, Haruko, though he didn't know her name, was trying to cover her sleeves with her hands, crying silently as water streamed down her face. The stripes looked darker when soaked, turning from blue to almost black. It reminded him of bruises. He wrote that night in his field log, "This doesn't look like victory. It looks like punishment." The line would never make it into official records, but it was the first time a note from a U.S. medic questioned post, surrender treatment of Japanese female POWs. Howard had seen many camps. He'd patched wounds on both sides. But this felt different. The women weren't defiant. They were humiliated into silence. The uniforms weren't for protection. They were tools of psychological control. Officially, over 10,000 POWs were processed each week across Asia after Japan's surrender. The system was a machine built on efficiency, not empathy. But machines break when one cog refuses to turn. During rations one morning, Howard slipped an extra bar of soap through the fence. The woman who received it didn't say a word. She just bowed once, slow, deliberate. A guard spotted it and barked, "Sergeant." "That's fraternization." Howard snapped to attention. "Just sanitation, sir. Rules are rules," came the reply. He nodded, but inside, something was shifting. That night, he cleaned out his medical kit and left a small roll of bandages behind the supply shed, where he knew they'd find it. It was reckless, stupid even, but war had already blurred every rule that used to make sense. Haruko used those same bandages days later to help another prisoner with an infection. Kindness passed in silence, and in that silence, rebellion began to whisper. Howard didn't know it yet, but his quiet defiance would spark something far bigger than pity. It would ignite a chain of forbidden empathy inside the camp itself. Because mercy once seen can't be unseen. The rain stopped, but the mud stayed. The striped uniforms, still damp, clung to the women like a second skin. The camp smelled of rust, sweat, and rotting canvas. And yet, somewhere in that rot, something human had begun to breathe again. It started with the smallest things. A bar of soap passed under the fence. A blanket left, accidentally, near the women's barracks. A glance that wasn't cruel. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were cracks in a system built on dehumanization, and through those cracks, light began to leak in. Haruko noticed the difference first. When a guard tossed her a canteen instead of kicking it toward her, she whispered, "Not all Americans are cruel." The women began to whisper the same to each other, like a secret prayer. But every small kindness came with risk. A medic giving a bar of soap could lose his rank. A guard showing leniency could face transfer, or worse. Still, these small mercies multiplied quietly, invisible to command. For 17 days, the Red Cross failed to reach the camp. Logistics delay, they said. During that time, hygiene conditions spiraled. Infections spread. One woman died of fever, her body wrapped in a tarp with no name tag. But for every loss, there was someone fighting to keep another alive. Howard found ways to help without being seen. Dropping iodine tablets in the laundry buckets. Leaving gauze where inspection teams wouldn't notice. He didn't speak Japanese, but empathy didn't need translation. One evening, as the women washed their striped uniforms by the stream, they caught sight of their reflections rippling in the water. The stripes blurred, dissolving into patterns. If the water can forget them, Haruko whispered, maybe we can too. The next morning, Howard noticed something strange. One of the women had folded her striped sleeves into neat cuffs, shaping them to look almost like her old nurse uniform, tiny, silent defiance. But kindness, once visible, draws attention. Higher command began to notice the shift, the softened edges of discipline, the moments of hesitation. No fraternization. The bulletin repeated, morale slipping. So when the crackdown came, it wasn't a surprise. The wire fences got higher. The rules got harsher. And Howard, whose quiet compassion had started it all, was suddenly under investigation. Because in war, mercy is always treated like a threat. The notice came at dawn, typed, stamped, and nailed to the mess hall post. Effective immediately, all personnel are forbidden from interacting with enemy POWs beyond assigned duties. The ink wasn't even dry before the camp changed. Guards who used to nod silently now barked orders again. The fence line doubled. Howard was called into the CO's tent, the flap snapping in the humid wind. "You've been soft, Sergeant," his superior said flatly. Discipline slips when men start feeling. The words cut deeper than the reprimand itself. By the end of the week, the camp had split into zones. 3 new fenced compounds rose fast, wood, wire, and watchtowers. None cooperative. Prisoners, mostly the ones who had grown close to sympathetic guards, were transferred to isolation areas. Haruko's group was one of them. They were moved at night, forced to carry their own bedding through ankle-deep mud. The striped uniforms, now stiff from repeated washings, made their silhouettes identical under the searchlights. "Don't talk. Don't look back," a guard warned. Howard stood near the gate as they passed. He didn't speak, didn't salute, just locked eyes with Haruko for a heartbeat before she disappeared into the new section. That look was enough to tell her, he's still here. Inside the new compound, the women's barracks were smaller, darker, and separated by wire mesh. The smell of disinfectant burned their throats. Guards patrolled more often, shouting instructions through megaphones. What little warmth had existed in the camp was gone. They feared kindness more than disease. Haruko whispered to her friend, "Because kindness spreads." Reports from that period show a spike in disciplinary incidents, small acts of defiance, stolen soap, smuggled letters. The crackdown had backfired. Fear didn't erase humanity, it hardened it. Howard's punishment was official now, demotion to sanitation duty, but that gave him cover. He could still move between sections, still see what command refused to see. Each day, he watched the women adjust, tighter, quieter, but unbroken. And though the wire fences were meant to divide, something unexpected started forming behind them. A quiet rhythm, a pact of survival. Because when the world strips you of freedom, sometimes the only rebellion left is solidarity. And that solidarity, whispered through the fence, was about to become their secret weapon. Night in the new compound was colder, quieter, and crueler. The guards' flashlights sliced through the dark like blades, sweeping over faces that refused to flinch. Every sound echoed: the creak of bamboo, the buzz of insects, the muffled sob that someone tried to hide. But in that silence something sacred was being born. Haruko began it, One whisper. Pass to the next bunk. No one cries alone tonight. It spread like a vow. Within hours, the women had built an invisible network, a pact. If someone broke down, two others would hold her. If someone was punished, another would share her rations. Small, defiant math against the vast machinery of control. They started trading skills. One woman had been a seamstress, another a nurse, another a clerk who could memorize every name in the barracks. Together, they rebuilt pieces of the world they'd lost. At night, when the guards' footsteps faded, they stitched. Hidden under blankets, fingers trembling, they tore small strips from old Japanese flags that had survived surrender. Using stolen thread, they embroidered tiny red suns onto handkerchiefs, symbols of the lives they'd left behind. Historians later found over 60 of these makeshift flags in museum archives, sewn by female POWs across Southeast Asia. Each one was a declaration whispered in thread: we still exist. When a new prisoner arrived, weak and terrified, the group would give her one of these handkerchiefs. You belong, they'd say softly. For women who'd been reduced to striped ghosts, belonging was a revolution. One night, Haruko pressed a handkerchief into her friend's palm and whispered, "They took our clothes, not our spirit." The words traveled faster than any official message, binding them tighter than the fences around them. Howard noticed the quiet shift. During sanitation rounds, he saw fewer blank stares, more steady eyes. Something unbreakable was forming behind the barbed wire. Something that didn't show up in reports. But every moment of hope carries its own danger. Rumors began to circulate about an upcoming inspection. Photographers, officers, maybe even a news team. They want to show the world how well we're treated, one guard joked. The women looked at their striped uniforms, then at each other. If the world was about to see them, then they would decide how they'd be seen. And when inspection day arrived, they were ready. The morning broke hard and blinding. Soldiers shouted, dogs barked, and for the first time in weeks, the camp gates swung wide. Trucks rolled in, kicking up dust. On their sides, painted letters U.S. RMISI Gmail, cars, cameras, lenses. Witnesses. The women were ordered to line up. Rows upon rows of striped fabric shimmered under the brutal sun, turning the compound into a field of blue and white ghosts. Sweat trickled down their necks. Some swayed from hunger. Others clenched their fists to stop trembling. Haruko stood in the front row, back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon. If they were going to be shown to the world, she decided she would stand like a soldier, because once she was one. Guards moved along the lines, tugging at sleeves, straightening collars, wiping dirt from faces with rough hands. "Smile," one said in broken Japanese. No one did. Army reports confirm that in late 1945, the Signal Corps took over 200 photos during PW inspections across Asia. The goal: proof of civilized treatment. But the irony was brutal. The same women stripped of dignity were now props in an image of mercy. The photographer adjusted his lens, muttered something about light, then snapped the first shot. The shutter clicked like a gun. Every flash captured shame disguised as order. Behind Haruko, someone whispered, "Don't look down." The women lifted their chins together. Small rebellion, perfectly silent. Their striped uniforms, meant to humiliate, suddenly looked like armor. A guard laughed nervously. "They look proud," he muttered. Why do they look proud? Haruko didn't blink. Her eyes locked with the camera for just a second. That moment, unplanned, defiant, would survive long after the uniforms rotted. When the session ended, the officers left smiling, satisfied with their evidence. But among the photos developed later, one image stood out. A blurred corner frame, a young Japanese woman's face, wet with sweat, staring straight into the lens. Her gaze burned through the propaganda. Years later, historians would call it the photograph that spoke back. But at that moment, in that camp, no one knew that a single flashbulb had captured the beginning of the end of their silence. Because when truth gets photographed, even by accident, it finds a way to travel. Weeks later, in a dim photo lab miles from the camp, a technician lifted a wet print from the developer tray. He blinked. The image was meant to show discipline, clean uniforms, orderly rows, but one face near the edge refused to obey. A young woman staring straight into the camera, her eyes, sharp, unbroken, almost angry, cut through the frame like truth itself. The technician hesitated. Then he set it aside, labeling it miss. But truth doesn't stay filed away for long. A few months later, that very photo surfaced in Tokyo newspapers during the early days of the U.S. occupation. Nobody knew who leaked it. Perhaps a journalist sympathetic to the prisoners, perhaps someone inside the military who couldn't sleep at night. What mattered was this: for the first time since surrender, the Japanese public saw the faces of their captured women. The reaction was electric. Readers flooded offices with letters. Families leaned over newspapers, whispering, "Is that her? Is she alive?" Reports say the image circulated over 80,000 times before censors pulled it. But by then, it had already done its damage and its healing. To Americans, it was just another archival photo. To the Japanese, it was revelation. A reminder that these women hadn't vanished into the jungle. They'd survived. Haruko didn't know her face had reached Tokyo. She didn't know strangers were crying over her photograph in ramen shops and train stations. But she felt something changing in the camp. Guards talked softer. The food portions slightly increased. There was a new tension, one made of awareness. Inside headquarters, officers fumed. How did this photo get out? One barked. These images were supposed to show compliance. But the picture didn't show obedience. It showed endurance, humanity refusing to vanish behind stripes. Haruko's defiant gaze had undone the narrative. Her silence had shouted louder than propaganda. And though no one told her, she'd just given her entire country a signal: we are still here. Soon, the echo would reach Tokyo's mothers, activists, and journalists. The storm that photo started was about to climb all the way to General Headquarters. Because once truth leaves the wire, it doesn't stop traveling, it starts knocking on power's door. Tokyo, early 1946. The city still smelled of ash and diesel. Whole blocks were skeletons of buildings, but life pulsed again. Markets reopening, trains clattering, papers selling out by noon. And among those papers, one photo whispered across the ruins the face of a Japanese woman in a striped uniform, staring back through the fog of defeat. People froze when they saw it. Some thought it was propaganda, others said it was a ghost. But mothers recognized something deeper: the expression of survival. In homes still missing sons, brothers, and husbands, this woman's eyes became a question: what happened to our daughters? Letters began pouring into occupation offices. Civilians wrote in delicate brushstrokes, "Please confirm if our girls are safe." Within weeks, U.S. General Headquarters logged over 300 petitions from Japanese women's groups demanding humane treatment and visitation rights for captured nurses and clerks. For the first time, compassion was crossing enemy lines on paper. Haruko's face, though unnamed, became the symbol. Tokyo journalists debated whether the image showed abuse or resilience. "She doesn't look broken," one editor said. "She looks like she's staring at history itself." Meanwhile, in the camp, the women had no idea their photograph had lit a fire thousands of miles away. They just noticed the subtle shifts: fewer inspections, slightly cleaner rations, guards instructed to maintain appearance. Command didn't say why, but somewhere pressure was building. In headquarters, officers argued over policy. "We can't afford bad optics," one warned. "The newspapers are watching." The same system that used the camera to dehumanize now feared it. Haruko's image had created what the war never could: a shared conscience. And far from the jungle, in university halls and women's groups across Japan, Meetings formed. Survivors of bombings and widows of soldiers gathered to write appeals. Our nation's honor, one declaration read, depends on how we treat our defeated women. The message reached across the Pacific like static, faint but persistent. It reached desks where regulations were drafted and ears that once heard nothing but orders. And in March 1946, that echo turned into action. A memo quietly circulated through Allied Command female POW attire to be standardized, khaki issue only. The stripes were about to vanish, but what they left behind couldn't be washed away so easily. March 1946. Inside the headquarters at Yokohama, typewriters clacked like distant gunfire. A memo slid across an officer's desk, stamped with quiet urgency. Effective immediately. Female POW attire to be standardized to khaki. No fanfare. No apology. Just bureaucracy cleaning up its conscience. But for the women behind the wire, the change felt like sunlight after months of rain. Trucks arrived before dawn, carrying boxes stacked high with new uniforms. Khaki sturdy, plain neutral. Not a stripe in sight. Guards unloaded them without a word. The old striped ones were gathered, folded, and dumped into burning pits at the camp's edge. The smoke rose thick and gray, twisting into the sky like ghosts leaving their bodies. Official documents framed the update as a morale and hygiene improvement. The real reason was simpler optics. The image from Tokyo had hit too deep, too wide. America wanted its victory clean again. Howard stood by the pit as the flames consumed the old fabric. He watched the stripes curl, blacken, and crumble. "About time," he muttered. Not to anyone, just to the wind. Haruko received her new uniform with trembling hands. She pressed it against her chest before putting it on. The khaki smelled of starch, foreign but soft. When she buttoned it, her reflection in the tin bucket almost startled her. She looked human again. Not a prisoner of shame, but a person standing upright. Around her, women smiled faintly for the first time in months. One whispered, "We're visible again." The transformation was instant but fragile. They knew the change wasn't mercy, it was management. Yet, even a performative dignity can begin to heal what humiliation broke. Reports later note that the uniform transition reduced disciplinary incidents by 42% in the following weeks. What those numbers didn't capture was the psychological weight, lifted when the stripes disappeared. Howard documented the day in his journal. They looked different today, not cleaner, freer. And though the guards pretended not to notice, something had shifted permanently. The camp felt less like a cage, more like a waiting room for a world that might someday remember them properly. Still, Haruko kept glancing at the smoke drifting over the tree line. Because some memories don't burn, they stain. The stripes were gone. But inside, every woman still wore them. And years later, those invisible stripes would return, in nightmares, in testimonies, and in one folded piece of cloth that refused to disappear. 2 decades later, a historian in Osaka pressed record, on a small tape machine. The woman sitting across from him, hair silver, back straight, spoke softly in Japanese. Her name was Haruko, and after 20 years of silence, she was finally ready to describe what the striped uniforms had done to them. "It wasn't hunger that broke us," she said, "it was shame." But across interviews conducted in the 1960s and 70s, 72% of surviving women from those Pacific camps said the uniforms, not starvation, not disease, were their worst memory. The stripes had become ghosts that followed them home, invisible but constant. Haruko described how some women hid their camp photographs, how others destroyed them. Many never told their families they'd been POWs at all. "People thought we were dishonored," one survivor said. "But we were just erased." The trauma lingered in subtle ways. When one woman heard a police whistle in the street, she'd freeze, because it sounded like the guard's inspection call. Another couldn't stand to wear patterned clothing for the rest of her life. Every stripe, Every seam was a reminder of power and helplessness woven together. Howard's war diary resurfaced years later in an archive box, yellowed and water-damaged. On one page, written faintly, "I still see their faces. I still see the stripes." He never returned to the Pacific. He left the army and became a hospital orderly, treating civilians until his death in 1959. But for the women, survival wasn't the same as freedom. The uniform had ended, the war had ended. But the memory kept marching. Some used it to rebuild, others folded it away literally. Haruko did both. She kept one piece of her striped blouse tucked deep inside a cedar chest, unwashed, unaltered. "To remember who I was," she told the interviewer, "and who they tried to make me forget." Her voice cracked when she said it, but her eyes didn't waver. Because surviving humiliation requires something harder than defiance. It requires endurance that outlives silence. And that silence, decades thick, was about to break one last time. In the next generation, someone would finally open that cedar chest, and inside, history would breathe again. Kyoto, 1983. A rainy afternoon pressed against the windows of a small wooden house. Inside, a young woman knelt beside an old cedar chest, her grandmother's. The smell of age, cedar, mothballs, paper, filled the room. When she lifted the lid, she wasn't searching for treasure. She was searching for answers. Inside were letters tied with fraying ribbon, a worn red cross tag, and beneath them fabric. Blue and white stripes, faded almost to gray. Folded so neatly it looked like ritual. She lifted it with both hands. The cloth was light, fragile, but carried a weight her arms could feel. "Grandmother, what is this?" she asked. From the next room came the slow sound of footsteps. Haruko appeared, older now, face-lined but steady. Her eyes caught the fabric, and for a heartbeat, she seemed to travel back 40 years, to the jungle heat, the shouts, the cameras. She sat down, her hands hovering over the blouse without touching it. She wore it once. The granddaughter would later tell a journalist. Then hid it forever. Haruko finally spoke. "They made us wear it," she said softly, "to erase us. But I kept it, to remember that we couldn't be erased." Outside, the rain deepened, tapping against the shoji screens like fingers on glass. The granddaughter folded the blouse again, carefully, reverently, as if closing a wound. Today, historians say only 14 striped garments from female POW camps survive in museums or family archives. Most are too fragile to display. Yet each one carries a universe of silence, shame, and endurance inside its seams. Haruko's blouse never made it to a museum. It stayed in that cedar chest, in that same house until her death. When her family opened it again, they found a note tucked inside. "Do not burn this. Someone must remember what cloth can do." No monument bears their names. No film dramatized their faces. But those stripes, burned, buried, forgotten, still tell a story the war tried to bury. Because history doesn't only live in medals or victories. Sometimes it survives in a single piece of fabric, creased, folded, waiting. A reminder that what we wear, and what's taken from us, can shape the memory of nations. And in those silent stripes, humanity still breathes.